Body Safety Australia acknowledges and pays respects to all traditional custodians and elders of this nation and the continuation of cultural, spiritual and educational practices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. This podcast was recorded in Naarm on Wurundjeri country of the Kulin Nation, and we acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Hello everyone. Welcome to The Kids Are Okay, your go-to podcast for making the hard chats easier. I'm Lauren French.
And I'm Deanne Carson.
And today we're talking about what we do best, which is consent.
And of course, this is a really timely conversation because SBS has just aired Jess Hill's documentary, Asking for It, which is all about consent.
It is. And guess what, Deanne?
I don't know, Lauren. I get the feeling that you're going to say to me that you were in the documentary.
Some could say starred. Some could also say smallly featured, but some could also say starred. But yes, it was an amazing experience for SBS to include us in that doco-series. Obviously, when they're doing a series all about consent, it makes sense to have us in there and have segments around what consent education looks like in the classroom currently, because so often these conversations are, like they'll have the political space and they'll have, parents, they'll have young people, but they don't always actually include what is currently being taught or what can be currently taught in schools.
Absolutely. And I'm really heartened by this documentary because we've been having these conversations since our inception in 2015, and at the time what we were saying was really controversial. We were talking about consent, we were talking about teaching consent to small children, and the internet, as it is wont to do, kind of melted down, right? But
what an understatement, kind of melted down.
Yeah.
But yeah, it did indeed.
It did. But what is so heartening to me is that, we persevered and lots of other people picked up this conversation, and it's now in a space where we can sit and have a really nuanced conversation about how we teach consent to young people and how we manage some of the things that come up, like how we manage backlash when it comes from young people themselves or when it comes from parents or teachers, and how we stay on top of what's happening in young people's lives. So, Lauren, the documentary is called Asking for It, and it explores how we understand affirmative consent and how we teach affirmative consent and how we sort of bring young people on this journey. And I know that they came out to film you at Western English Language School. So you were working with young people who come from a migrant refugee background, right? They're at school, they're learning to speak English before they go into another school. And there was this beautiful moment, I thought, where you were talking about consent and you were running through an activity with them. You were asking them to stand up, sit down. Tell me about that. Yeah,
it's really fascinating when you're the educator in front of the room, in front of the students, because it's a perfect example of, power of the things that affect consent, and you can show it in a really simple way. So as an educator at the front of the room, I can ask everyone to stand up and then sit down and then stand up again and put an arm up and then sit down and then clap their hands and then turn around and then jump one time and then sit down. And the students will look at me like, you're crazy, and they'll be like, what's going on? But they'll do it. And then when we have a conversation about, okay, so did any of you actually want to stand up, sit down, turn around, arm up, jump down 3 times, whatever I said? And they'll be like, no, of course not, that was ridiculous. And I said, okay, so why'd you do it? And there was this beautiful moment on their faces, particularly at that school, because we were working with so many translators. Because, the whole room had, I think at one point I had 8 different language groups.
Yeah, right.
And so there was a room full of different translators, and, I was asking them that question. The translators were then, translating, and you could see their faces start to go, I don't know why I did it. Like, other than, well, you're the teacher. You told me, I just did it. And it's such a simple way, particularly when you're dealing with barriers of language, when you're dealing with barriers of culture, when you're trying to have that really simple starting point of, okay, well, like, this is consent, but this is what's affected consent. And it was so easy for them then to understand the deeper conversations we had, because they were like, oh yeah, I just experienced this 2 minutes ago.
I think there's so many things that I love about that clip, Lauren. And the first one is that often when we are talking with schools or early childhood centres, they say, oh, no, the parents here aren't going to support discussions of consent because of cultural differences or because of faith differences. And yet here you were in a room full of people who have only been in Australia for a matter of months, some of them.
Some a week. I had someone who had only been in Australia for 1 week.
Right. And yet, how did the lesson go?
Amazingly, because they were able to grasp the concepts. We also, particularly at those schools, we had, like we do in all schools, but we had particularly made space for parent workshops and to have a space for parents to come in with translators, with me, to actually learn what the young people were going to learn, to have a really open space for questions. And every parent workshop I did at those schools, the parents were just in a space of, thank you so much, I'm so glad this is happening. Like, there was real appreciation for the fact that this was going on at the school. When we then did the lesson, the students did amazing, and there was so much people were like, oh, but they're not really going to grasp that concept because of the lack of English, because of this. And I was like, no, they're going to 100% get it. And they did. The activities we did, what they came up with, what they drew, what they wrote, was incredibly perceptive of what consent means to them.
The other thing that I found really amazing, Lauren, is that it's so important when we're talking about consent to talk about power. Like, you cannot talk about consent without talking about power, because if you talk about consent without talking about power, you're kind of assuming that everyone is on the same level, and then you go, well, why don't you just say yes, or why don't you just say no without the complexity of that? But sometimes if you're talking about power just from a gender perspective, you get a lot of pushback, right?
Yep.
Not all boys, not all men, like hashtag not all men, right? And of course we know that it's not all men, but we also know that this is gendered. But when you introduce power from that position of you being an adult and them being teenagers, and B, you being in a position of authority, and them being sort of kind of a captive audience, right?
Legitimately.
Yeah.
Locked library doors.
Locked. They weren't locked, were they?
Maybe not locked, but yeah,
right.
no, exactly.
But there's this understanding in school that you're not allowed to leave the room because you'll get into trouble. So introducing power that way kind of removes the backlash.
Well, yeah, it's an easier way for power to be consumed by people. And I think so often, as you said, a lot of the consent conversation has been watered down to no means no and yes means yes. And as if something so nuanced could be so simple. And I understand why people wanted to do it that way, but it completely, disempowers people from actually the reality of the world that we live in, and the fact that power is everywhere. And it's really, it's funny, as soon as you talk to teenagers about this particularly, they'll name age, race, gender, money.
Okay, so what you're telling me is teenagers understand power imbalances, yeah?
They do indeed.
And they understand it in a really nuanced way. They understand about how social standing gives you power over somebody else. Money. I mean, I've had teenagers tell me, that your residency status is important when you're thinking about power imbalances. And yet, something still happens when we talk about gender.
Yep. I think what was really fascinating when a few classes that we've had where the gender stuff comes up is young people were almost sitting in this space of, but we want to be gender neutral, we want to be, and that we want to have equality, and so therefore we can't talk about the gendered drivers, the gendered imbalances, because that then isn't talking about equality. Without really understanding that, yes, I can see where we want to talk about equality, but we're not there. And pretending that we don't have gender imbalances, or that gender doesn't play a role in power, in consent, in all of this sort of stuff, means that we're kind of putting blinders on and missing a huge chunk of what affects people.
And what I've noticed is that when we talk to, a mixed gender group, and we say that girls are more likely to be victims of sexual assault than boys. There's an understanding that that is true.
Mm-hmm.
And we say that boys are more likely to enact sexual harm than girls, and there's an understanding that that is true too. However, I've noticed that it's often a girl who will go, yeah, but boys are sexually assaulted too. What is that about?
I think it's coming back to that, I don't want to be man-hating, I don't want to be putting everyone in the box. So therefore, anytime we talk about the fact that more men perpetrate sexual violence than women, someone has to equal the stage. It's like when we go, we need a balance of male and female voices, we need a balance of this sort of stuff, because we have to be seen as balancing it from an equality perspective, not an equity perspective.
Right, and I absolutely agree with you. We see this, boys can be victims too, and that is absolutely the case. We know that, and I know that, statistics are slippery things, right? And some statistics say 1 in 5 boys, some statistics say 1 in 7 boys. That's really high. And yet there's this assumption that when we're talking about boys as victims of sexual assault, that genders flip. And so it's always a girl or a woman who is the perpetrator, right? So how do you have that conversation of talking about boys as victims, as survivors of sexual assault, allowing space for them to be vulnerable to, to not have to sort of suck it up and be a man, but also make it clear that this is still a gendered crime?
And I think it is that authenticity of going 100% there is valid spaces to have this conversation. When we talk about victims, yes, let's talk about victims, but talking about victims can't then, dull the conversation around perpetrators. One can't then go, we're not going to go as heavy here or as deep here because we don't want to, ruffle feathers. When actually, no, if we're going to talk about victims, we have to talk about perpetrators. We have to talk deeply about it, and we have to, it's that balance of, yes, everyone has their moment, but now we need to refocus on the fact that we are all agreeing on the same thing here. But we need to see how that plays out then from a perpetrator space, not just... It's that same with language, and people talk about this all the time in media, in news coverage and these sort of stuff around, violence against women. It's always, and this was done to someone, this person, we're not talking about who's enacting the harm.
Exactly.
And so it's that flip that I think is really helpful, because we don't have to talk about, one versus other. It's actually, let's talk about who enacts harm.
So when we think about the people who might be listening to us now, I don't know, tell us who you are, but I'm guessing they're parents, they're guardians, they're teachers, they're, people who work within schools, maybe in wellbeing, maybe as principals. And it's all very well for us to say, that this is a gendered issue and this is how young people are responding. So we know that teenagers the demographic most likely to be victims of sexual assault. And we know also that teenagers are the demographic most likely to enact sexual assault. But as they become adults, they're less likely to be perpetrators of sexual assault. So somewhere along the line, they learn how to respect other people's body boundaries and a greater understanding of consent. So for us to do that work of preventing sexual assault amongst peers, we need to be having conversations with the adults earlier. So what are some of the things that you want the adults who are, have children in their lives who are like 13, 14, 15, what do you want them to know?
I want you to know that these are conversations not that you should be having, you need to be having with your young people, and that we shouldn't actually be waiting for a time where you as the adult go, I'm now viewing my child or this young person in front of me as old enough to have this kind of conversation, or I'm waiting for them to tell me they've got a partner or that they have a crush on someone, and from there then I'm going to have a conversation with them about all of the importance of consent and this space and power and all of the stuff in between. This needs to be a conversation had earlier. this needs to be, and I say conversation, this needs to be conversations, this needs to be consistent. This has to be something that you are really open with your young people about, and creating a space where they can be open to you. You know, we don't want our young people to think that they're always going to get told off for anything they tell us. Like, we want it to be an open space. But we also don't want to be, you know, treating our young people, it's that two space you said before. They're just as likely to be victims as they are to be perpetrators. And so we need to be talking with our young people, not with the assumption that they're hurting people, but with the understanding that they could, and that they could be doing it with absolutely no intent, malice, or understanding of the harm they're enacting from a place of ignorance. And so how, as the adults, do we actually step in to have that conversation early, so that even when they're just thinking about it, they haven't talked to someone, they haven't had a relationship, they're not doing it yet, they're just thinking about it, that thought process has an understanding of power and consent, and, you know, how to handle rejection and what that looks like in a social situation, and how we have relationships with other people, even friendships, not even just romantic relationships or sexual relationships. Like, this has to be really, you know, to an extent, a slightly blunt conversation at times.
Yeah. And I think for me, it's that kind of analogy of, you wouldn't start teaching your teenager about the road rules after they've got their P plates.
Exactly.
Right? You're having those conversations from when they're very, very young, not because you're about to hand them the keys to your car, but because you understand that knowledge has to be built over time before they can do something that's really high stakes.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think it's that there's a lack of perception of the fact that if you're not teaching them, they're not learning. Because even, like, if you're not having that chat and you haven't had the chat yet, well, then they're still learning about relationships, how you react to other people, how you deal with big feelings and emotions. They're still learning that.
Totally. And how you deal with rejection, right? Which is a whole conversation in itself, you know, like, have we equipped our young people to handle rejection? But actually, I wanted to talk about something else, Lauren. I want to talk about the law, because this is really interesting to me. A lot of spaces that we go into, the young people know what the law says. They know from the perspective of, if I do this, I'm breaking the law. Like, if I have sex before I'm 16, I'm breaking the law. Or if I send a nude of myself to, you know, my partner consensually, I'm breaking the law. Which kind of tends to push them underground, right? It becomes subversive behaviour that they're not, you know, like, if they get into any hot water there, they're not going to share it with an adult because
they're going to get in trouble. They've broken the law. They're going to jail.
Well, not just going to jail. So many young people say to me, oh, I'll be on the sex offender register for the rest of my life, and I won't be able to get a job as a teacher or a tram driver. Or it's like, you know, this fear has been instilled in young people around breaking the law.
Yeah.
To manage their own behaviour, though, so often what I see is people who are potential victims are having their behaviour modified through fear of the law.
I think and this is a space we see all the time, of that, talking about the law. What are the consent laws? What's the legal obligations? You know, we must have young people understand what the law tells them. And to be really clear, I am not a lawyer. However, the law is a minimum low bar.
Yeah.
Like, and when we do nothing but talk about the law, it is harmful. Because it's harmful to victims, because 100% they do not reach out for help when they assume they are going to be, you know, get the stick end of the law, and that they're going to end up on a sex offender registry. So it hurts victims because they don't come forward, they don't reach out, they don't help seek. And it also is harmful because I've had conversations with young people who are telling me, so if I do this, then that's not technically breaking the law, is it? And I'm like, oh, great. So we want to be having sex where it's just borderline consensual, like, or we're having sex that just isn't going to get you in jail. Because what that's setting up is a complete lack of understanding of consent, boundaries, of what we want young people to have sex relationships like, which is not, I want to do this just to avoid prison.
It's kind of like when adults talk to young people about the law, we forget that there are people involved in sex, right? Like we forget that if a young person is approaching it from a space of what can I get away with without breaking the law, that they're actually supposed to be doing something with another person, not to another person.
But that's the thing, when you're looking at a legal perspective, it's that too, it's the individual, it's the what am I doing and what have they done, and completely battling each other in it.
So this is a really interesting space now, because in Australia, 3 states now have affirmative consent laws. So New South Wales, Tasmania and now Victoria have affirmative consent laws. So, you know, to be really simple about it, yes means yes rather than no means no. Like, what did the person who was instigating the sex do or say to ensure that the other person was consenting, rather than what did the person who was being approached for sex do or say to say that they weren't consenting. Really, really big difference, but it changes the conversation because now we're starting to say, what is the person with the power doing to kind of
Make a no easier.
Make a no easier?
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Well, it's that perspective of when we go, okay, I'm asking for consent. So I did the asking. Deanne, would you like to have a hug? I'm asking for consent. What I then need to have an understanding of is, what is our power dynamic, or me and the person I'm asking? If I have power over them, if I have more power than them, have I created a safe space where this person feels comfortable to say no? Have I given options and avenues that they know that they can say no without risk of harm? Or whether that's emotional, physical, social, you know, like that they aren't going to have a really negative outcome for saying no. You know, have I given all of that to them? Have I made an effort to make sure that they really want to do whatever I'm asked them, that is really a thing that we're, as you said, doing together, rather than I'm just going, I want to do this thing to your body, click here for yes.
Yeah, sign this contract.
Exactly.
Right. So now we've come to a really interesting space, because now the law is asking us to teach consent from an ethical perspective rather than from the bare minimum that the law says that you have to do in order to be consenting, which is what we have always done. So what I want to talk about is, how do we do that? Like, you know, we talk with young people about consent, and they know, young people know. Yes means yes, and, you know, and they're able to talk about enthusiastic consent and the times where consent is still consent but maybe not enthusiastic, right? And they know that force is wrong. They know that jumping out from the bushes with a knife is a terrible thing to do, right? They understand that. But where the interesting conversation happens, and I think where the prevention of sexual assault happens, is when we're talking along the consent continuum and we're saying only consent is sex and everything else is sexual assault. And that includes compliance,
pressure, coercion.
Yeah.
100%. And I think that's the thing, the conversations I've had with young people where it's so law specific, they'll go, yeah, but if I pressured them, if I threatened them and they said yes, it's still consent. And if they're coming from a purely legal perspective, they go black and white.
Yeah.
They go, yeah, I didn't have a knife, but I was still exerting power. But they still said yes, therefore it's fine. And so we have to go, that's why you have to take them away from legally, out the window, whatever, ethically. Is that actually ethically consensual? Is this a space that is safe? Is this a space that's considered? And once you start pointing out to young people that difference between compliance, pressure and coercion, and when they start to see when they comply in their regular lives, you know, when they comply to homework and laws and just other things, when they have pressure, when they have, you know, coerced someone without even really considering that's what they did. then they're so much more reflective of their actions.
Totally.
Once you start pointing it out. Even if you point it out non-sexually, so just simple examples of when someone might have, bribed a friend to do something, or, threatened someone with something.
Or pressured them.
Exactly, because, because it was a thing and I really wanted you to do it because I didn't want you to miss out, so I pressured you without me even thinking that's what I did. Once you start to make that map for them, they're so much more self-aware. And they're more likely to hear themselves do it. They'll come up and tell me, oh, Lauren, the other day I realised I was kind of pressuring someone. And I was like, that's amazing that you actually noticed it.
They never wanted to do those things. They were compliant in that. We know that.
Mm-hmm.
And as an adult, I can say, yes, I took advantage of that. But when it comes to another person's body,
mm-hmm.
right? So we can say we've all misused our power in one way or another, but when it comes to another person's body, or when it comes to another person's image, we have to be really, really reflective on and honest about what power we hold and whether we misuse that or not.
And that's, to be really clear, this isn't saying power is bad.
No.
Because so often people go, oh, you're talking about, how terrible it is that people have power. And I'm like, no, everyone has power. Everyone has some level of power over another person. There's always going to be something. A perfectly balanced relationship is, I don't know, one that exists, because there's always going to be stuff. This is not about power is bad. This is about, you need to know what your power is.
Yep.
You need to know how your power affects others, how it influences others. When you walk into a room, what is your power doing to the room? And yeah, there are times, as you said, as a parent or, as a teacher in a classroom, you use your power to make the lesson go smoothly, to get everyone safe and on the same page, and to teach something. But I need to know when that power is doing the thing I want it to be doing the thing that's helpful for the room, doing the thing that's helpful for another person, and when it's not.
Yep, totally.
Okay, so I know, Deanne, you're talking about what we can help, for adults having this conversation. But I am curious, because I know we've had discussions before about the fact that, this age group is an age where young people, some of the greatest influence on young people is not necessarily their parents or the adults in their life, and I'm curious to talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because what we know is when children are very little, their parents, their caregivers, are the greatest influence on them, and they influence their values and they influence their behaviour. And as they go to school, teachers become, an influence on children, peers become an influence. But as we hit these adolescent years, young people really, they might still be really close to their parents and their family, or they might not, but they really seek their peers' influence in this space. They're listening to their peers, they're seeking their peers' help in navigating tricky situations, and I don't know what I want to say about that.
That's fair. When we think about, other young people influencing each other so greatly, how then, I guess, as the adults, how can that knowledge help them in these conversations, knowing that a lot of their young people are going to be turning to each other before they necessarily turn to the adult?
Yeah. And let's be honest, it's not just each other, it's online spaces as well. So it's all the media that they're consuming, social media, gaming, wherever it might be. There are a lot of influences that are happening outside of the family, which is absolutely fine. But as the adult in a young person's life, having conversations about values is super important. As parents or as teachers within a school, we think that we have a shared set of values. But if we don't sit down and have conversations about it, we don't actually know whether our teenagers who've got these emerging identities really share our values or not, or even understand our values.
Can I ask, what's the difference between a family rule and a family value?
Well, family rules are things that we have to do, right? We all have to put our dish in the dishwasher at the end of the day to make the family work. Family values are such integral things. They might be things like the rule might be that we don't have phones at the dinner table, but the value might be we sit together as a family, we have conversations, we connect. It's important that we come together at the end of the day and have that connection. So they're very, you might have rules that are around your values, but your values inform them.
Yeah. And it almost sounds a little bit like we move towards our values. Rules are kind of the thing you don't want to do, or it's almost the rule is we're not doing this because we're moving towards the value. But as you said, yeah, if you only do the rule, or if you only do we're not doing that, we're not doing this, we don't do this.
And we can forget. We can forget to talk about our values and just focus on the rules, right? So our rules, might be about, we don't send nudes to people, but our values inform that rule. But the other thing that I want to talk about is what we see for so many teenagers is that they are now saying that if something happened, if they were being pressured or coerced into sending nudes, or they had witnessed a sexual assault at a party, or something really awful had happened in their life or the life of a friend. So many young people would say to us, we're not going to tell our parents. They're not the people that we would go to. Even those teenagers who have loving, close relationships with their parents. And I think this is a really, really important conversation to have as adults, and go, some things teenagers can solve and some things adults need to step in and solve.
I could not agree with you more about how important this conversation is, and clearly it is something that is on people's minds, because it's actually a perfect segue into our first question box.
Oh,
I know.
What's in the question box?
Well, you'll find out in a moment. We have said in last episode, and what we're going to be doing every week, is that at the end of the episode we're going to have space for a question box, which is an anonymous question that has been sent or given to us by a parent, a teacher, a school staff member, a young person even, like anyone. And the question I'd actually picked for today, hilariously, was something that I have been asked multiple times in different spaces, and often by educators in the room with us, because in the programs the educators will hear young people say, I wouldn't talk to an adult about that. I wouldn't talk to a teacher. I wouldn't talk to my parents. I wouldn't talk to anyone. So they hear that, and then you instantly see their eyes go, oh no, because the question they ask is, how do we help young people understand what issues need a grown-up?
Yeah, that's an awesome question, but I think it's a two-part question. How do we help young people know which problems young people can solve and which problems they need an adult for? But also, how do we make sure that adults are people that young people can go to? So what do adults need to do to let young people know that they're safe?
Because it's very well and good for us or any teacher or any educator to be going to young people, talk to your grown-ups at home. But if the grown-ups at home have absolutely no idea how to have these conversations or how to do it safely or what are the things that might come up, then when we're kind of equipping young people with advice that doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah, and there's this disconnect, right? There's this understanding from young people that I can't talk to my whoever their person is about this because they'll be angry, they won't understand, they're too old, and the list goes on, all of the reasons why. But when you speak to their parents, caregivers, teachers, they're devastated because, of course, I'm a safe person for my young person to talk to. And what we know is we, as adults, we have to be preemptive in this. How does your young person know that they can talk to you about sex if you've never spoken to them about sex? How can your young person know that you're the one who will pick them up from a party if something is going terribly wrong, if you've never spoken to them about the things that can go terribly wrong in a way that's not blaming and shaming?
Yeah.
Right? So we know this about teenagers. They make decisions that perhaps aren't so wise. And if, as the adults in their lives, we stop and we say, well, that was a really stupid thing to do, we've told them that they can't come to us about bigger things.
Yeah.
So for the person who wrote in, my reflection would be, firstly, what work have you done to let the young person know that you can have this conversation? And then if you have done the work, I would be sitting down and with your teenager and writing a list of things that teenagers can solve.
Mm-hmm.
I forgot my lunch. I forgot my, my Mikey card or my Opal card or whatever it might be. Or, I've fallen on, things that teenagers, normal stuff. And what problems do we need an adult for? And then ask them, who are those adults?
And when you ask them who are those adults, don't, not going into that space of, I'm telling them who their safe adults are. I'm going, well, I'm the safe adult and your auntie Lauren is the safe adult, and you're not dictating to them who they go to, because you might be assuming there are safe people who might be completely safe, but actually your child is just not going to go talk to them, which is really normal. Like I grew up with a very large family. My mum's one of 7. I have so many aunts and uncles and cousins and amazing people in my life. Growing up, I could have talked to any of them, but I had people I would go to more likely than others. And it's that understanding of, you want to know who your child, who your young person, who you're talking to, who they view as safe.
But we have to, as parents, because, I've done the parent thing right, we have to take our ego out of this, because if our teenager says it's not us, that's kind of...
Hammer to the heart.
I know, right?
Take a moment.
But if they have people, that's all that actually matters. Does the young person have people? I think the other thing that I want to say on that too is that teens can help each other. So yes, it might be an adult problem, but how are we as adults equipping them to help each other? Because this is what often happens. They'll be woken up at 2-3 o'clock in the morning with notifications from their friends, something devastating has happened, and all these teens are up at 3 o'clock in the morning talking to each other about it. Nobody's going and waking up a parent saying, can you help, right? So how are we equipping them not just to talk to adults about something that's happened to them or that they've done, but to facilitate that connection between someone who needs help and an adult who can help them.
Okay, so amazing. So for the person who's called in, anyone else who has thought about that question before, to recap of what we've gone through, we were talking about how are you actually signalling to your young people that you are a safe person to talk to? How have you let them know preemptively, not waiting until, something has happened to let them know that these are the spaces you can come to an adult for? Where is the, space of talking to our young people, where to ask them, what would you go to a friend for, and what do you think an adult might be helpful for? To make that not so much I'm telling you this, but asking conversation with them.
How you're a good friend, right? And how you connect the person who, really needs help and really can't think straight and probably is in a state of fear or shock or, whatever. How can you, as a good friend, be the conduit between the person who needs help and the people who can help?
Deanne, I think we've had an amazing conversation today. I have loved this. So today, obviously, we've talked a lot about consent. We've talked a little bit about legal and ethical and, the education space that we sit in. And it's been amazingly fun. Next week when we're back, we're going to be talking about...
We're actually going to be talking about consent, but with younger children. So we talked a lot about teenagers today and really navigating those spaces. But we get asked all of the time, what age should you start teaching about consent? And when we say when babies are born, or 3 or 4 years old, people go, but how do you do that, right? So that's what we're going to be talking about next time.
So we'll see you then. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for joining us this week and making space for these hard chats. Thanks to our amazing podcast producer, Jade Jones, and our incredible composer of this music and all music you'll hear, Jade Perry. If you want us to answer your question box questions, head to our Instagram at Body Safety Australia and follow the link in our bio.